A new, unusually quiet windmill appeared in Peppa Pig's garden. It was a gift from Daddy Pig, initially bringing novelty and calm. Its blades rotated slowly, emitting a barely audible, lulling hum. Peppa and George were delighted. Mummy Pig found it peaceful. No one could have imagined this harmless object would become the source of something deeply unsettling. Mummy Pig began spending more time near the windmill. She listened to its monotonous hum, claiming to hear whispers, then instructions. Her speech became fragmented. She forgot daily chores, her gaze often distant, as if seeing something no one else could. George, mesmerized by the spinning blades, watched them for hours. He grew unnaturally quiet, his eyes wide and glassy. He started mimicking the windmill's slow, rhythmic motion, as if guided by an invisible force. Peppa was the first to notice the growing unease. She tried speaking with Mummy Pig and George, but their replies were hollow, often just repeated phrases that seemed to echo the windmill's hum. She felt increasingly isolated, surrounded by her family but unable to reach them. Daddy Pig dismissed her concerns at first, blaming fatigue or new interests. He tried to keep normal routines, but their detachment became too obvious and disturbing to ignore. Then a new neighbor arrived, Puss in Boots, styled like a Peppa Pig character. Curious and adventurous, he was immediately drawn to the windmill, but unlike the pig family, he sensed its sinister presence. He tried to engage with them, but their altered behavior made it nearly impossible. The windmill's influence deepened. Its hum filled every room. The family's movements aligned with its rhythm. They began seeing strange patterns in everyday objects, interpreting them as part of the windmill's truth. One night, Peppa, lying on the top bunk, noticed George was awake below. His eyes reflected a faint, pulsing light from the windmill outside. He whispered the same phrases Mummy Pig had repeated earlier. His voice was calm, flat, stripped of childlike emotion. Horror gripped Peppa. George was no longer himself. Daddy Pig finally realized the depth of the change. He tried to dismantle the windmill to break its hold, but Mummy Pig and George stood silently in his way. They didn't resist physically, but their stillness, their empty expressions, made him hesitate. One by one, the family was absorbed into the windmill's reality. They didn't vanish, but their minds were gone, taken. What remained were empty vessels, moving by the distorted logic of the windmill's hum. There was no violence, just quiet, complete assimilation. Seizing a moment when Puss in Boots distracted them, Peppa ran. She turned back to see her family, vacant-eyed, moving in sync with the windmill. The house itself seemed to vibrate with its hum. The morning at Peppa Pig's house began as usual. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and Mummy Pig was making breakfast. Peppa and George sat at the table happily eating pancakes. Daddy Pig read the newspaper, snorting with satisfaction. Everything was peaceful, just like always. But something was different that day. George, normally cheerful and loud, was unusually quiet. He didn't ask for seconds, didn't laugh at Daddy Pig's jokes, and ignored his favorite toy, Dinosaur. Mummy Pig noticed first. "George, dear, are you all right?" she asked. He only nodded. His eyes were blank, and his smile looked painted on. Peppa tried to play with him, but he turned away, staring at nothing. At the playground, where laughter usually echoed, George stayed alone. He didn't run with Pedro Pony or jump in puddles with Rebecca Rabbit. His friends, Susie Sheep and others, tried to include him, but he just waved them off like he couldn't hear them. As days passed, George became worse. He avoided people, moved stiffly, and spoke in a flat tone. He stopped playing, drawing, or watching cartoons. The only thing that interested him was an old, worn book he found in the attic. He spent hours flipping through its pages, though it had no text or pictures, only strange symbols and patterns. Peppa tried to peek, but George clutched it tightly. His eyes were cold and distant, with no trace of his usual sparkle. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, Peppa heard strange noises from George's room. Not crying or laughter, something between a whisper and a rustle. She crept to the door and opened it slightly. George was sitting on the lower bunk, and above him, his dinosaur toy hung, gently swaying as if alive. George murmured to the book, his body trembling slightly. A strange smell filled the room, like old paper mixed with something Peppa couldn't place. A chill ran down her spine. She didn't know what was happening to her brother. The next morning, George was gone. His bed was empty, and the book lay open on the floor. On one page was a drawing that hadn't been there before, a silhouette of a piglet dissolving into the strange symbols. Peppa called Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig, but they only shrugged, thinking George was playing hide and seek. But Peppa knew better. Something had changed. The world felt wrong. Familiar sounds now seemed eerie. She stared at George's empty bed, her eyes full of something deeper than childish fear. Something had taken her brother. She didn't know if he'd ever return. And the scariest part, she began to notice how the shadows in the house grew longer, and the whispers became clearer. The sunny day slowly faded. Peppa and George played in their room, their laughter echoing through the house. Everything seemed normal, but an odd tension lingered in the air. George, busy with his toy car, suddenly froze. His gaze locked onto the window, where tree shadows swayed in an eerie, unnatural rhythm. Peppa noticed his silence and came closer. "What's wrong, George?" she asked. He only shook his head, eyes fixed on the window. A strange sadness filled his expression. At dinner, George was unusually quiet. He barely touched his food and stared blankly at the table. "George, are you feeling okay?" Mummy Pig asked gently. He nodded slowly, his movements detached. Daddy Pig tried joking, but George didn't respond. That night, they lay in their bunk bed, George below, Peppa above. Peppa couldn't sleep. Strange sounds came from below, whispers she couldn't understand. Then a faint rustling sound, like something sliding across the floor. In the morning, Peppa awoke to silence. George's bed was empty. She searched the house, but he was gone. Mummy and Daddy Pig were worried. "George?" Mummy Pig called. No answer. The house felt hollow, as if something vital had disappeared. On the table lay George's toy car, faded and worn, its plastic dull and cracked. Days passed, but George didn't return. Peppa sat by the window, staring at the unmoving shadows outside. Mummy Pig sighed more often. Daddy Pig had gone quiet. Their skin grew pale, their faces tired and gray. The house, once full of laughter, echoed only with silence and unanswered questions. One evening, Peppa sat in her room. A familiar rustling sound came from beneath the bed. Her heart raced. She leaned over and looked underneath. Nothing but dust and old toys, until she saw it. A toy car, identical to George's. She picked it up. It was cold, unnaturally heavy, and rough to the touch, like stone. A chill ran down her spine. She turned toward the window and saw her reflection, but it wasn't her. The eyes staring back were hollow, the skin gray, lifeless. Her lips didn't move, but in her mind a whisper echoed, "Now you are with us." The house fell silent, and outside, the shadows continued their silent, endless dance. Forever. The morning in Peppa Pig's house began with an unusual silence. The sun barely penetrated the thick curtains, leaving the room in semi-darkness. George, usually sleeping on the bottom bunk, was motionless, and Peppa on top felt a strange numbness. Mummy Pig wasn't preparing breakfast. Daddy Pig wasn't reading the newspaper. The house was plunged into an unsettling quiet. Peppa came downstairs, her steps echoing in the empty hallway. She found her parents in the living room, sitting on the sofa, their gazes fixed on an old television broadcasting a strange show. Familiar faces of friends flashed across the screen. Susie Sheep, Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, but all of them were dressed in green tracksuits, and their faces expressed not childish delight, but eerie concentration. Beside them stood figures in red jumpsuits with black masks resembling guards. One of them, tall and slender, with a circle on his mask, turned to the camera. His voice, distorted by the speakers, said, "The game has begun." Peppa tried to call her parents, but they didn't react. Their eyes were empty, and their faces were frozen in indifference. She ran to the television trying to turn it off, but the buttons didn't work. The image on the screen became brighter, and Peppa saw Susie Sheep, usually so cheerful, performing some task with a stone face. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and Susie disappeared. Only a green splatter remained in her place. Peppa recoiled in horror. She looked at her parents again. Their bodies trembled slightly in sync with what was happening on the screen, but their facial expressions remained unchanged. Suddenly, George appeared in the doorway. He was also dressed in a green suit, and his eyes were as black as the guards on the screen. "You're next," he whispered in a voice that wasn't George's. Peppa ran. She burst out of the house, but the world outside was just as alien and distorted. The sky was crimson, and the trees seemed twisted and dead. In the distance, she saw a giant doll, similar to the one in the show. Its head slowly turned, and Peppa heard a familiar melody. She ran without looking back, but knew there was no escape. Cold permeated her body, displacing fear. Evening came. Peppa Pig's house was full of the usual activity. Mummy Pig cooking dinner, Daddy Pig sorting papers, Peppa drawing, and George playing with dinosaurs. Suddenly, George went silent. He sat still, staring at one point, unresponsive to Peppa's voice. She moved closer, but he didn't react. His eyes were empty, as if seeing through her, through the walls, through everything. This wasn't like George. His skin grew pale, his pink fading. Peppa grew uneasy and called Mummy Pig, but wasn't heard. She shook George. He was stiff, almost stone-like. She shouted louder. Mummy Pig came and grew worried too. Daddy Pig joined them. George seemed trapped in a trance. His breathing was shallow and he felt weightless. The room turned cold, despite closed windows. Peppa shivered. George's eyes darkened. Mummy Pig hugged him, but he stayed cold. Daddy Pig suggested going to Dr. Elephant. Then George suddenly stood up. He slowly turned to Peppa, smiling unnaturally. It wasn't his smile. It was something alien. Peppa backed away. George walked toward her silently. Mummy and Daddy Pig tried to stop him, but he pushed them aside effortlessly. His strength was terrifying. Peppa tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. George approached, eyes glowing with a cold, strange light. He reached out to her. She felt numb, paralyzed. He touched her. The world blurred. Colors faded. Sound vanished. Something inside Peppa began to dissolve. She was changing. The last thing she saw was George's eerie smile. She was no longer Peppa. She had become like him. Silence settled over the house. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig stared at their children, both lifeless and hollow, eyes locked on nothing, faces pale and blank. They stood side by side like dolls. No one knew what had happened. No one knew what would come. There was no more laughter, only a cold, silent presence. And far beyond their world, something waited. It was just beginning. It wanted everyone, and it will. Very soon. It's already close. It's already here. Sunny day slowly gave way to twilight. In Peppa Pig's house, everything was as usual. Daddy Pig was reading a newspaper. Mummy Pig was watering flowers on the windowsill. Peppa and George were playing in the living room, building a tall tower of blocks. Suddenly, Peppa heard a strange, barely audible whisper. It came from behind the wall, as if someone was trying to say something, but the words were indistinct. Peppa listened intently. The whisper repeated, a little louder this time, and Peppa felt a slight tingling in her ears. She looked around, but no one seemed to hear anything. George continued to play enthusiastically. Mummy Pig was humming a tune, and Daddy Pig was peacefully dozing. Peppa approached the wall from where the whisper came. She put her ear to the cold surface. The whisper became clearer, but still remained incomprehensible. It sounded like many voices speaking at once, intertwining and merging into a single, disturbing hum. Peppa felt her heart beat faster. She tried to call Mummy Pig, but her voice caught in her throat. The whisper became more insistent, as if trying to penetrate her mind. Peppa recoiled from the wall, feeling dizzy. She thought she saw shadows moving at the edges of her vision, but when she tried to focus, they disappeared. She closed her eyes, trying to get rid of the intrusive sound, but it only intensified, turning into a cacophony that filled all her thoughts. Peppa opened her eyes. The world around her had changed. Colors became dull and sounds muffled. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig continued with their activities, but now they seemed distant and alien, like actors in a poorly staged play. George sat on the floor, his eyes empty, and a strange, serene smile frozen on his face. Peppa tried to touch him, but her hand passed through his body as if he were a ghost. She realized that she too had changed. She no longer felt her body, no longer heard her breathing. She was part of this whisper, part of this silence. She was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. She watched as Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig continued to live their ordinary lives, unaware that their children had disappeared, dissolved into this whisper in their own distorted world. The whisper continued. Now it was her own voice, a voice she didn't recognize. It called others, those who were like her, those who had also dissolved into this silent presence. And they came. The shadows grew denser, filling the house, filling the world. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig continued to smile, unaware that they were no longer alone. Something was with them, something that whispered in their ear, something that slowly but surely took them, and soon they too will become part of this whisper. The lost episode of Peppa Pig that never aired. A sunny day illuminated Peppa Pig's house, filling it with familiar laughter. Peppa and George played in their room, where a bunk bed stood against the wall, George on the bottom, Peppa on top. Mummy Pig cooked in the kitchen, and Daddy Pig read the newspaper in the living room. Everything was as usual, but a slight, barely perceptible tension hung in the air. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, and Daddy Pig went to open it. Dr. Octopus stood on the threshold, his tentacles ominously writhing. His gaze was unusually empty, and his movements stiff. He didn't smile as he always did. Dr. Octopus entered, his steps heavy and slow. He surveyed the room, his eyes resting on Peppa and George. The children felt a chill run down their spines. Mummy Pig tried to speak to Dr. Octopus, but he only made a strange guttural sound. His tentacles began to move faster, casting an eerie shadow on the wall. Peppa and George hid under the bed, their hearts pounding. They heard strange sounds from the living room, sounds that shouldn't have been in their house. Daddy Pig tried to protect his family, but Dr. Octopus was too strong. His tentacles grabbed Daddy Pig and he vanished into the darkness. Mummy Pig screamed, her voice full of terror. She tried to run, but Dr. Octopus was faster. She too disappeared, leaving the children alone. Peppa and George trembled with fear. Huddled together, they heard footsteps approaching their room. The door slowly opened, and a silhouette appeared in the doorway. It was Dr. Octopus, but now he looked different. His tentacles were longer, and his eyes glowed with an ominous red light. He extended his hand towards them. Peppa and George closed their eyes, awaiting their fate, but instead they felt a gentle touch. Dr. Octopus simply stroked their heads, his gaze full of sadness. Dr. Octopus slowly turned and left the room, leaving the children in silence. They didn't know what had happened, but they knew their lives would never be the same.